So it seems like every elk hunting video on YouTube is just a guy getting in a screaming match with a bull and then a bull running at him with the same regard for his life as a deer and the headlights of a Ford F-150 moving 80 miles an hour. But if you actually want to know how to kill elk on public land, as in all the tactics you need to know for high pressure elk, then this is the video for you. All right, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to touch on is wind. If you are not checking your wind every, I would say 30 minutes just if you're in your general hunting area, and I would say 10 if you're earlier in the evenings or later in the mornings when that wind starts to switch because of the warmer climate that you're going to be in, then you're not going to be seeing elk because that wind is switches a lot. It switches a lot and swirls a lot when you're in the mountains. And if you are not checking your wind when you're making an approach on an elk, you're not going to kill that elk. I mean, they respond the same to bad wind and smelling you as you would respond to a guy throwing a haymaker at your face. I mean, you just not a good deal. You just want to get out of there. It's like, this is cool and all, but I don't feel like getting in a fight today. Or in their case, I don't feel like getting killed today. So they're going to hightail it out of there. So you need to be checking your wind and you need to be consistent with checking that wind. So get a bottle of wind checker. And then every time you feel that wind switch, make sure you give that thing a couple puffs and make sure you know where the wind's going. One more thing as a side note before we move on from wind is if you are on benches or drainages, or really any area of topography on a mountain, generally that wind is going to be swirling. And what you can do to avoid that is hang out on the side of the bench or off the bench a ways or off the side of the drainage, out of the drainage, or wherever you're at, where that wind's going to be more consistent going up and down that mountain. It's just a good tip. One of my favorite tactics to use because if you know there's elk on a bench and you try to wait there with bad wind, it'll eventually swirl through there and you'll kick out all the elk. So back off 200 yards, 300 yards, maybe even 5 or 6, lay down for a little bit, take a nap, eat some food, recuperate, get a good plan, make sure that wind's consistent, and then move back in on that area. So we got to talk about the different ways that people can pressure elk. If you get a lot of hikers moving through an area, the elk will usually push further back into the mountains because they don't know that those aren't hunters trying to kill them. They're just trying to get away from all the people. If you get people clearing trails, it can be hunting guides clearing trails before hunting season, or you could have Forest Service workers. I've seen them clear out a trail and all the elk are gone when they goes through an area because usually they have chainsaws and dirt bikes and they're making a big ruckus in the woods. You have dirt bike riders and ATV riders. Elk are going to hear those loud machines and they're going to want to hightail it out of anywhere close to those roads. So you got to keep in mind if you're in an area with a lot of recreational activity, then those elk are going to tend to be further from those trails unless it's an area where elk are very used to people, which is pretty much impossible to find. Then those elk are usually going to be a little bit further from the trail. So you're going to have some more walking to do. And then obviously you have hunters moving through an area. Usually they're not checking their wind either, and they're going to be pushing elk further into the mountains. And then one thing that not many people talk about is grazing animals that will push elk further into the mountains. The main two being sheep and cattle. I've seen cattle clear out entire areas of elk just because they outcompete the elk. You get a big group of cows going through an area and they will knock out all the forage that the elk like. So make sure you're looking out for the cattle and the sheep. Make sure you're looking out for the hikers and the recreational riders. And then most importantly, make sure you are looking out for other hunters because all of those will contribute to elk pressure. So elk calling deserves its own section here. And I'm not going to tell you guys how to call, like where you put your tongue when the call and all that, because there's plenty of videos out there that will teach you how to do that. Like Corey Jacobson, that's where I learned to call. Elk Nut, I also learned to call from him. That's and like the different calls you make. That's not what we're going to get into. What we're going to get into is what calls and what calling setups are actually successful when you're elk hunting. So Going through the woods with a bugle and just bugling your brains out is not going to get any elk to come in. They're too smart for that. They know that the elk don't bugle, because if the elk start bugling, they get hunters that come in and try to kill them. So instead, they keep their calling very minimal. They keep their calling to a complete minimum, only if it's essential. And bulls will only let out usually very short, infrequent, kind of half-hearted bugles. And then cows don't do big whiny cow calls like you hear everybody talking about. They do very short mews and chirps, only just to kind of like if they're close to the herd to make sure they know where everybody's at. So the calling setups you should be taking are not getting on the edge of a mountain and letting out big bugles into a valley and seeing if you get a response. What you should be doing is getting on the edge of elk habitat, and then get your calls out and set up with the wind right. Always make sure the wind's right. I'm going to keep saying it. And then get your calls out. And what you can do is make a little blind calling setup. So, how you're going to do that is you're going to get set up about 150 to 200 yards, maybe a little closer. Maybe you get about 100 to 150 yards from where you think the elk are going to be. And that might be a bedding zone, it might be a meadow or some water they're at. It doesn't really matter as long as you're close and there's a lot of fresh sign. And you're going to set up and you're going to find where the elk should be moving through. And you're going to find where they're at, and you're going to get close, but not too close. And then you're going to make a couple soft cow calls. Nothing crazy. Don't get out your bugle tube and cow call through that. Just a couple out the mouth cow calls. Real simple. Nothing crazy. Now wait 20 or 30 minutes, because the elk usually don't respond. What they'll either do is come into your call, or they'll take note of where they heard that, and they might come back an hour later, 2 hours later, or 3 hours later. But obviously, you don't have the time for that. So wait 20 or 30 minutes and keep your eyes peeled, because you're not going to hear them coming in. They're going to sneak in to where they can see where they think that elk was. So instead, after 20 to 30 minutes, if you don't hear anything, keep moving. Move another 200 yards, set up again, soft cow calls. Now you can get your bugle out and use that to cow call through, but honestly, there's really no point, because if they're far enough away where they can hear you calling through your bugle tube, they're probably not going to come in, because elk are not going to come from 400 yards away to your soft cow chirps. They're going to come 50 yards, they're come 60 yards, maybe 100 if you're really lucky. They're not going to go out of their way to get to your cow calls. So instead, you have to go out of your way to get to them. Now, on occasion, you do get a wimpy bugle in response, or you do get a cow call in response. In my experience, that usually means they want you to go to them, not they're coming to you. If they were coming to you, in my experience, they're usually quiet. And that's how I've spooked a lot of elk, is letting out a couple calls, thinking the elk are not in the area because they didn't respond. And then I start moving and I kick up the elk that was coming in, and I could have shot at 40 yards. So instead, if you do hear a response, get a little closer and get to the point where they just can't take it anymore and they have to come see what you are, right? So you hear a little wimpy bugle 100 yards away, 150 yards away, move in 70 yards, 75 yards. Cut that distance in half. And if you hear another wimpy bugle, then cow call and then move in a little bit. Don't cow call while you move in, because they're going to know where you're stalking from. But if you don't hear a response, then usually that means the elk is coming your way. So give it that 30 minutes and wait and be patient. Now, if you do hear a response and it sounds like they're walking away, it depends on the situation. If you think you can go after them, I try to go after them. If you think that the wind wouldn't be right, or check the wind, or the topography wouldn't be right, then usually it's best to stay back, because they will be back through there. It's only a matter of time, especially if they think there's another elk there. So just wait and be extremely patient and wait at least 30 minutes before. I mean, don't set a timer though and have a timer going off on the mountain because that'll scare all the elk away. But check the clock. If it's 5:30 p.m. when you set up calling, then wait till 6. Wait till 6:10. Can you and then, can you wait 5 more minutes? Now don't sit there for an hour and a half waiting for the elk to come in cuz at that point they probably didn't hear you or they don't care. So, be wise and then keep the calling to a minimum and you'll have elk coming in or at least responding. Finally, we get into hunting tactics. This is probably the part you came for. Here it is. So, if you're hunting high pressure elk, which by the means of YouTube elk hunters is unorthodox, then you have to get into some unorthodox hunting tactics. So, this means pretty much anything besides calling an elk because you're not probably not going to call an elk on high pressure units. So, this means sitting trails, sitting meadows, sitting wallows, still hunting, and then the one I really want to touch on, which we'll talk about towards the end of this, is I call it unintentional drive hunting. Kind of a long, uncatchy phrase, but we're going to get into it. So let's get into ambush hunting. Elk are still going to hit wallows. Elk are still going to travel trails. Elk are still going to need water. They're still going to need food, right? And they're still going to need bedding areas. If you know where the elk are bedding, which is usually a very shaded slope, whether it's west facing or north facing, then you know that there's got to be food and water nearby because elk need food and water, obviously. So you can find those areas they're moving through to get to that food and water and hunt over those. So finding a good trail that goes from their bedding areas to their feeding areas or their uh, watering areas to their feeding areas or watering areas to bedding areas can be very effective. Now, you don't necessarily want to sit over the food and over the water because 9 times out of 10, elk have multiple places they're feeding at and watering at in any given day, right? They're not like deer, they don't go back to the same place every day. They like to switch it up, they like variety in their diets and I guess in their water. So you got to switch it up. When they're switching it up, they generally will take very similar trails, though. So let's say I know where the elk are bedding on this north facing slope over here. I know that they have to go over here to get food because there's a lot of meadows over there. And they have to go over here to get water because there's a lot of water over there. Well, then these areas in between are usually going to be packed with trails. And if I find a good looking trail that's been used every day, and this is where trail cameras help in the scouting season, then I can sit over those, and those elk are usually going to be moving through there, and I will get a good shot at them. Now, you can move through those meadows and get really close to killing elk or kill an elk. I've almost done that just on this past hunt in September. I was moving through a meadow and had two bulls at 62 yards trying to stalk in closer, but they never came back for the remainder of the days we were in that area, which just goes to show that when they get pressured, they get sporadic and they're going to go where they feel the safest. So, that is a very successful style of hunting, is just ambush hunting. Next, we have still hunting. Still hunting, there's not much to talk about with still hunting. It's still hunting. You move really slow and try to find the elk before the elk find you. Right? So this means you're going to be walking as quietly as possible through the woods. And as you're walking quietly and slowly as possible, you need binoculars for this. You're going to be glassing through areas where you think there's going to be elk, right? So if you see a good looking stand of young pines, which elk usually like to bed in, that has a lot of shade, you sneak within bow range, just the edge of your bow range, and then glass it. And then you hopefully will see an elk in there and you can sneak in a little bit closer or try to call and get it to stand up and then you shoot it. Still hunting can be very, very effective for elk hunting if you do it right. If you go moving through the woods too loud, you're gonna kill the area and you're gonna spook all the elk out of there. You're not gonna kill the elk, you're gonna kill the area. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, it doesn't matter how much noise you make when you are elk hunting because elk don't care about noise." Wrong. They 1,000,000% care about noise. They care about everything. If elk neglected noise, then they'd be relying on nothing but their eyes and their nose. And then wind isn't always perfect, and they can't always see 360 degrees around them. They are just as attentive to hearing and sounds as they are to their nose and to their eyes. That doesn't mean you can't fool them, right? If you break a branch or two, because elk are very used to branches breaking. But that doesn't mean be as loud as you want. You cannot be as loud as you want. The elk are gonna hear you coming, and they're gonna be looking in your direction before you ever see them, and they're gonna get out of there. So you got to be quiet. You can get away with a couple branch breaks and rolling a couple rocks, going through a little bit of underbrush, but you cannot get away with a lot of it. You will just kick the elk out of there. So find a good area along the outside of a bedding area. Check that wind and move quietly through there. Not fast, not with bad wind, only when you have good wind. And then move very quietly and slowly. This wouldn't be high pressure, unorthodox elk hunting if we didn't talk about how to use the pressure to your advantage, which is where we get into my phrase unintentional drive hunting. So when you get a lot of hunters at a trailhead or moving through an area, then you're going to get a drive going through there. Now, they don't know they're doing a drive because they don't see each other and they're just moseying through the woods. But you're going to get a drive through there. So let me show you with this diagram. Let's say there's a trail right over here. Here's the top of a mountain or just some sort of flat area. And you got elk in here, right? Now, these people know there's elk in here, or they don't, and they're just going to go through here. 9 times out of 10, they're not going to be checking their wind because they're stupid and they don't know how to kill elk, and they're not going to be quiet. So they're going to just push from that trail all the way through here. Now, what I know you're thinking, how does this help me? You're just telling me how everybody spooks the elk. Helps you in two ways. You know not to be these idiots, and you can also do this. So let's say these guys are getting in here at 6:50, 7 o'clock to go move through this area in the morning. Now, if you get in here when that wind's consistent around 5:45, now you have to be an early bird and you have to get up early for once. You can move through there and you can get on the other side of where these elk are going to be and where these hunters are going to be, right? Now, this doesn't mean you're going to have the elk like running practically running you over, but you will most likely see or hear them moving out of the way of these hunters. So here's how it would work. About 5 o'clock, you wake up, you get down here, and you get past everybody, right? So that let's say that wind's going down in the morning. Let's say you follow this ridge, you got good wind, you get on the bottom lip of this. Now, when all those hunters come down this trail right here and they move through this flat spot, they're going to kick all the elk down to you, right? So then you can either see the elk and chase them, or you can hear the elk and you'll know where they're at. Or you'll get on the other side and there will be no elk movement and you'll know to get out of there. So then you already have a huge advantage on everybody else because while everybody else spends the next 2 or 3 days over here, you know that the elk bailed off the side of this mountain and they're down in this valley, let's say. So there you go. The unintentional drive hunt. So that's going to wrap up this video. Those are the best tips I could compile for any public land high pressure elk hunter out there. And I know it's not a lot, but trust me, if you employ the tactics given to you in this video, you are going to be seeing more elk. You're going to have way more opportunities at elk. You're going to be hearing more elk. You're going to be further away from hunters, and you're going to be in a more secluded area with better experiences and better elk hunting, and hopefully more filled elk tags. We'll see you guys later.